At 10 a.m. on July 26, 1943, the air over the Markham Valley in New Guinea was thick enough to drown in. At 20,000 feet, where the temperature should have offered a freezing reprieve from the malarial jungles below, the tropical sun baked the plexiglass canopies of the American fighter formation into suffocating greenhouses. The pilots were flying in a combat theater that forgave nothing. If the Japanese didn't kill you, the weather, the mountains, or the sheer crushing distance of the Pacific Ocean would. First Lieutenant Richard Ira Bong did not seem bothered by the heat, the distance, or the mathematics of survival. He was 22 years old, a round-faced, incredibly quiet kid from Poplar, Wisconsin. To the outside observer, he looked like a cherub in a flight suit. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he lacked the swaggering, cinematic bravado that usually defined fighter pilots. But behind the quiet exterior was a mind perfectly calibrated for the geometry of aerial violence. Bong had grown up on a farm, operating heavy machinery before his feet could reach the clutch of a tractor. He had learned to shoot deer in the deep woods of northern Wisconsin, understanding lead, trajectory, and the absolute necessity of getting close to your target before pulling the trigger. When the Army Air Forces put him in a cockpit, they discovered that Bong didn't just fly an airplane, he operated it like a finely tuned piece of farm equipment. He understood exactly what a machine could take and exactly where its breaking point was. The machine the Army gave him was as unorthodox as he was. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. In the summer of 1943, the P-38 was a revelation, but it was not a dogfighter. It was a massive, twin-boom interceptor powered by two 1,150 horsepower Allison V1710 engines. It weighed over 8 tons fully loaded. To the Japanese pilots flying the featherweight hyper-agile A6M0s and Nakajima K-43 Oscars, the Lightning looked like an ungainly twin-tailed target. They assumed it was too big to fight. They were fundamentally misunderstanding the physics of the P-38. Because the Lightning had two engines with counter-rotating propellers, it suffered from zero engine torque. A pilot could jam the throttles to the firewall, and the aircraft would track perfectly straight without the violent twisting force that plagued single-engine fighters. More importantly, the twin-boom design meant the propellers were moved off the nose. This allowed Lockheed engineers to pack the entire armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, tightly into the central nose cone. In a standard fighter, like a P-51 or P-40, the guns were in the wings, angled inward to converge at a specific distance, usually 300 yards. If a target was closer or farther than 300 yards, the bullets sprayed wide. But the P-38 had no convergence point. It fired a solid, concentrated buzzsaw of lead that traveled in a perfectly straight line. Whatever it touched, it erased. Richard Bong understood this weapon. He knew the P-38 couldn't outturn a Zero, so he simply decided he would never turn. He would use the Lightning's massive weight and twin engines to dictate the fight in the vertical, plunging from altitude, firing at point-blank range and zooming back up before the Japanese could bring their nimble fighters around. Before we follow Bong into the cockpit for a mission that would completely rewrite the tactical realities of the Pacific Air War, if you believe the men who flew these incredible machines deserve more than just a footnote in history, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real, unfiltered military history is worth sharing. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this engagement. And I want to ask you, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment, and we want to honor their legacy. Now, let's go back to the sky over New Guinea. On this particular morning in July, Bong was leading a flight of P-38s tasked with escorting a massive formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers and B-17 flying fortresses. Their target was the sprawling Japanese logistical hub at Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea.
Leh was heavily fortified. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming, and they had assembled a massive reception committee. As the bomber formation droned heavily toward the target, the American radio suddenly cracked with frantic static. Climbing up from the jungle airstrips below, emerging from the tropical cumulus clouds like a swarm of angry wasps, was a massive formation of Japanese fighters. There were dozens of them. Estimates put the number of defending Zeros and Oscars at anywhere from 30 to 40 aircraft. They were climbing fast, shedding their external fuel tanks, organizing into attack elements to slaughter the lumbering American bombers.
Bong's element of P-38s was heavily outnumbered. The tactical manual dictated that when faced with overwhelming superior numbers, an escort fighter should stay close to the bombers, maintain a defensive posture, and only engage targets that actively threatened the heavies. But Bong knew that a defensive P-38 was a dead P-38. The only way to protect the bombers was to break the cohesion of the Japanese swarm before they could organize their attack runs. You didn't defend by waiting, you defended by initiating absolute chaos. At 20,000 feet, Bong reached down and pulled the manual release levers for his external drop tanks. He watched the heavy silver teardrops tumble away into the void below, freeing his twin-engine monster of its parasitic drag. He didn't check his six, he didn't call for help. The Wisconsin farm boy simply shoved his twin throttles to the firewall, pointed the heavy nose of the P-38 directly into the center of the rising Japanese armada, and initiated a screaming power dive. The 12 most violent minutes of Richard Bong's life were about to begin. To understand the sheer, terrifying violence of Richard Bong's attack on July 26, 1943, you have to discard the cinematic myth of the dogfight. Real aerial combat is not a graceful, circling dance of knights in the sky. When flown correctly by a master of energy tactics, it is a brutal mathematical execution. When Bong shoved the throttles of his P-38 Lightning forward and pointed the heavy nose of the rising swarm of 30 to 40 Japanese fighters, he was converting potential energy into kinetic energy on a massive scale. Gravity grabbed the 8-ton fighter, and the airspeed indicator instantly swept past 350, then 400 miles per hour. The aerodynamic roar outside the canopy grew deafening, drowning out the synchronized mechanical scream of the two Allison V1710 engines. But diving a P-38 at these speeds carried a terrifying built-in risk. The Lightning was so fast and its wing design so thick that in a steep dive, the air rushing over the wings could approach the speed of sound. This created a localized supersonic shock wave that disrupted the airflow over the tail. The control stick would turn to concrete. The aircraft would lock into the dive, completely unresponsive to the pilot's desperate inputs, until it slammed into the earth or the dense lower atmosphere ripped the wings off. It was called compressibility, and it had killed several test pilots. Richard Bong knew exactly where that invisible aerodynamic wall was. He rode the absolute ragged edge of it, his airspeed hovering just below the red line, his hands fighting the heavy, stiffening control yoke. He was plunging straight into the center of the Japanese formation. The enemy pilots, flying highly maneuverable Nakajiva K-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi A-6M Zeros, saw the massive twin-tailed American fighter hurtling toward them. Standard Japanese doctrine against a diving attack was to use their incredible agility to wait until the last second, snap into a tight horizontal turn, and watch the heavier American plane blast helplessly past them. The Japanese pilot in the lead Oscar initiated his defensive brake. He banked sharply to the left, pulling his nimble fighter into a turn radius so tight that a P-38 could never hope to follow it. But Bong had no intention of following him. Bong understood the concept of deflection, aiming not at where the enemy aircraft was, but where it was going to be.
Because the Lightning's 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon were packed tightly into the nose, Bong didn't have to worry about the converging spray patterns that plagued other fighters. He possessed a laser-straight buzzsaw of armor-piercing and incendiary projectiles. At a closing speed of over 450 miles per hour, Bong made a microscopic adjustment to his rudder pedals and control yoke. He pulled his nose slightly ahead of the turning Oscar and clamped his hand down on the trigger. The recoil of the centralized armament actually shuttered the massive airframe of the P-38. A dense, concentrated stream of lead and high-explosive 20mm shells intersected perfectly with the flight path of the turning Japanese fighter. The results were catastrophic. The unarmored Oscar didn't just absorb the hits, it was structurally deleted. The concentrated burst sawed through the engine cowling and shattered the wing root. The aircraft erupted into a blinding ball of aviation fuel and tumbling aluminum, instantly disintegrating before the pilot could even register he was under fire. 1 kill. The dogfight was less than 30 seconds old. Bong didn't linger to watch the wreckage fall. The moment he fired, he hauled back on the heavy control yoke with both hands. The G-forces hit him like a physical blow, draining the blood from his head and narrowing his vision to a dark gray tunnel as he pulled out of the dive. He had successfully executed the boom. Now came the zoom. Bong traded his massive kinetic speed back into altitude, pulling the P-38 into a staggering, near-vertical climb.
Infuriated by the sudden destruction of their wingman, a trio of Japanese Zeros rolled inverted and tried to follow the climbing American fighter. They hauled back on their control sticks, their lightweight engines screaming as they pointed their noses straight up, determined to catch the P-38 before it could escape. Bong checked his rearview mirror. He watched the Zeros climbing after him. He didn't panic. He simply let physics do the work. The lightweight Japanese fighters were built for horizontal agility, not vertical energy retention. They lacked the sheer momentum required to sustain a climb at those speeds. One by one, the pursuing Zeros hit their aerodynamic ceilings. Their airspeed bled away, their flight controls turned mushy, and they stalled out, hanging suspended and helpless on their propellers for a terrifying fraction of a second before gravity reclaimed them. Bong, still riding his massive wave of stored energy, crested the top of his zoom climb thousands of feet above the stalling Japanese fighters. He casually rolled his P-38 onto its back and looked down through the top of his canopy. He had become a deadly high-speed pendulum. He was high, he was fast, and the enemy was disorganized, slow, and desperately trying to regain their airspeed. He dropped the heavy nose of the Lightning and initiated his second dive. He targeted one of the Zeros that had just stalled and was clumsily trying to level out. Bong swooped down with the inevitability of an executioner. He closed the distance in seconds, waiting until the Japanese fighter entirely filled his reflector gun sight. He fired a devastating point-blank burst directly into the Zero's cockpit and engine block. The aircraft snapped violently to the right, trailing a thick ribbon of oily black smoke, and began a terminal plunge toward the Markham Valley. 2 kills, less than 2 minutes into the engagement. By relentlessly attacking, diving, and climbing, Bong was achieving exactly what the tactical manual said was impossible. He was single-handedly breaking the cohesion of a massively superior enemy force. The Japanese pilots were no longer organizing their attack runs on the vulnerable bombers flying above them. Instead, they were swarming like kicked hornets, desperately trying to catch the lone twin-tailed monster that was tearing their formation to pieces. Bong had successfully drawn the entire weight of the Japanese interception force onto himself. But as he pulled out of his second dive, his situational awareness caught a terrifying development. The Japanese were adapting. They had realized they couldn't catch him in a climb, so they were changing their geometry. As Bong prepared to initiate his third vertical attack, a pair of Nakajima Oscars anticipated his flight path and set a trap, diving from high altitude to intercept him at the bottom of his arc. Bong was suddenly sandwiched between the jungle canopy below and highly maneuverable enemy fighters diving from above. He was losing his altitude advantage, and in a P-38, losing altitude meant losing your life. In the three-dimensional geometry of aerial combat, altitude is a bank account, and First Lieutenant Richard Bong had just spent his last dollar. At the bottom of his second dive over the Markham Valley, the 22-year-old Wisconsin farm boy found himself in the deadliest position a P-38 Lightning pilot could occupy. He was low, his airspeed was bleeding off as he leveled out, and two Nakajima K-43 Oscars were plummeting from the sky above him, perfectly positioned to drop right onto his tail. If Bong tried to pull up and climb, the diving Japanese fighters would effortlessly slide into a firing solution and rake his exposed cockpit with cannon fire. If he tried to turn, the featherweight Oscars would turn inside him in a matter of seconds. He was sandwiched between the unforgiving green wall of the New Guinea jungle and two veteran pilots who had just mathematically cornered him. Bong did the only thing the physics of the Lightning allowed him to do. He attacked the trap itself. Instead of turning away, Bong hauled the heavy control yoke hard over, kicking the rudders and whipping the massive 8-ton P-38 around to face the diving Oscars head-on. It was a game of aerial chicken, played at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. The tactical manuals explicitly warned against head-on passes. They were considered a coin toss where both pilots were equally likely to die in a mid-air collision or a hail of engine black shrapnel. But Bong Lidu, the math was rigged in his favor.
The Japanese Oscars were armed with synchronized machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, firing through the spinning propeller blades. It was an effective system, but it lacked concentrated density. The P-38, however, housed four 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered together in the nose. In a head-on pass, the Lightning was essentially a flying shotgun firing a slug. Bong didn't flinch. He watched the leading Japanese fighter grow from a speck to a distinct, terrifying shape in his windshield. At 500 yards, the Japanese pilot's guns winked, sending tracers snapping past the Lightning's twin tail booms. Bong waited until 300 yards. Then he squeezed the trigger. The concentrated burst from the P-38's nose met the incoming Oscar like a solid wall of lead. The heavy American armor-piercing rounds smashed through the Japanese fighter's glass canopy and tore directly into the engine block. The Oscar didn't even have time to smoke. It instantly disintegrated in a blinding flash of pulverized metal and ignited aviation fuel. Bong had to violently jam his control stick forward to avoid flying through the burning debris of his third kill. The second Japanese pilot, witnessing his wingman vaporized in a fraction of a second, broke his attack run. Human reflex overrode tactical discipline. He banked sharply to the right, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the twin-tailed monster. That instinctual break gave Bong his final opening.
He tracked the fleeing fighter, pulled a slight lead deflection angle, and fired one last devastating burst. The rounds walked cleanly across the Oscar's right wing, severing the spar. The wing ripped away from the fuselage, and the aircraft tumbled uncontrollably into the dense jungle canopy below. 4 kills. The engagement had lasted exactly 12 minutes. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his fuel mixture was running lean, and the Allison engines were running terrifyingly hot from the sustained firewalled abuse. The remaining Japanese fighters were reorganizing, their numerical advantage still overwhelming, but their cohesion was completely shattered.
The American B-25 and B-17 bombers had slipped past the chaotic melee and were currently pounding the Japanese logistical hubs at Leh into dust. Bong's job was done. He dropped the nose of the Lightning to treetop level, pushing the throttles to the stops. The P-38 accelerated across the valley floor at well over 400 miles per hour, leaving the slower Japanese fighters miles behind in its wake. When Bong finally touched down on the dirt and pierced steel planking of the forward airstrip, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft. The mechanics who popped the nose panels to check the ammunition bins found them practically empty. Bong climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his expression as calm and unreadable as a man who had just finished plowing a field back home in Poplar. For his impossible 12-minute rampage on July 26, 1943, Richard Bong was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He had proven that a heavy twin-engine interceptor could completely dismantle a numerically superior force of agile dogfighters, provided the man in the cockpit had the cold, mechanical discipline to never fight the enemy's war. Bong would go on to become the undisputed ace of aces. He shot down 40 confirmed enemy aircraft, earning the Medal of Honor. The brass eventually grounded him and sent him home, terrified of losing their greatest hero in a random dogfight. Tragically, Richard Bong survived the most brutal air war in history, only to die on August 6, 1945, the very same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He was killed back in the United States when the experimental P-80 Shooting Star jet he was test flying suffered a primary fuel pump failure and crashed in California. He was 24 years old. The history of the Second World War is built on the raw data of combat reports and the blood of the men who flew the missions. Here at WWII Frontliner, we don't just read the sanitized summaries, we dig into the archives to bring you the unfiltered reality of the front lines. These are the vital, gritty histories we owe it to ourselves to remember, and the stories we must pass down to our sons. If this story reminded you of the sheer grit required to strap into a P-38 Lightning, please hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it ensures these forgotten corners of military aviation stay alive. Subscribe so you never miss a briefing. And before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment, and we want to ensure these names are never lost to time. Richard Bong trusted the machine, and he never turned with a zero. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.